I never expected to spend my 68th birthday sleeping in an abandoned carriage house at the edge of the Cotswolds, surrounded by the faint scent of motor oil and the damp chill of English autumn. Yet here I was, fumbling with an unfamiliar iron key, in the dark tears blurring my vision as my son's words echoed mercilessly in my mind. "You're just a useless old woman, Mother. What would you even do with a real inheritance? Father knew that." My hand trembled as I finally managed to slide the key into the rusted lock. The ancient door groaned in protest as I pushed it open, the beam of my flashlight cutting through decades of stillness. And that's when I saw it. I froze in place, my breath catching, as the light revealed what lay inside. This couldn't be possible. This couldn't be what Richard had meant when he left me just the carriage house in his will. But let me back up. You need to understand how I ended up here homeless on my own birthday, clutching a suitcase that contained the remnants of my 42-year marriage. The day had begun with me standing beside my son in our solicitor's office. Julian immaculate in his tailored charcoal suit, and me in the black dress I had worn to Richard's funeral 3 weeks earlier. Mr. Hastings, Clara Hastings, our family solicitor for decades, seemed unusually uncomfortable as she prepared to read the will. "Before I begin," she said, adjusting her spectacles, "I want to assure you that everything here is legally binding and precisely as Mr. Whitmore instructed." Looking back now, I should have recognized that statement as the warning it truly was. The reading itself passed in a blur, but certain phrases stood out with devastating clarity. "To my son, Julian Whitmore, I leave our London townhouse and my primary investment accounts. And to my beloved wife, Eleanor Whitmore, I leave the property located at 14 Coachman's Lane, the carriage house, and its contents." A carriage house. After 42 years of marriage, my husband had left me. A carriage house. Julian's face transformed instantly from solemn grief to something close to triumph. He placed a hand on my shoulder, squeezing a bit too hard, as he leaned down to whisper, "Don't worry, Mother. I'll make sure you're taken care of." I had been too stunned to respond, too bewildered to question why Richard, my Richard, would do such a thing. Where was I supposed to live? What was I supposed to do? The answers came brutally clear that evening when Julian drove me back to what I still thought of as our home, the elegant townhouse overlooking Kensington Gardens that Richard and I had shared for 15 years. I had barely stepped through the doorway when Julian set my suitcase down in the marble entryway. "I think it would be best if you found somewhere else to stay, Mother." I stared at him, not comprehending. "What do you mean, this is my home?" "The townhouse is mine now. It's in the will." His voice carried that polished detachment he used in business meetings. "I'm having colleagues over tomorrow to discuss turning Father's study into an office, and I need to begin making changes." "But where am I supposed to go?" I asked quietly, the question trembling in my throat. Julian shrugged. "You could stay with Aunt Margaret for a while. Or there's always that carriage house Father left you." He laughed softly, cruelly. "Though why he left you that dump is beyond me. What are you going to do with it? Open a mechanic's shop at your age?" Something inside me cracked, then a deep, invisible fault line shifting. "Julian, this is my home. Your father and I—" "It's not your home anymore," he cut me off sharply. "It's mine. Father made that perfectly clear." I reached for the back of a chair to steady myself. "I need time to find somewhere to go." "Surely you don't expect me to leave tonight?" That's when he said it, the words that would echo in my mind for hours afterward, as I drove aimlessly through the rainy London streets, eventually finding myself in a narrow country road leading toward an unfamiliar village at the edge of the Cotswolds, staring at a weathered carriage house half swallowed by ivy. "You're just a useless old woman, Mother. What would you even do with a real inheritance? Father knew that." The cruelty in his tone had been so unexpected, so unlike the boy I once cradled, that I couldn't even respond. So here I was, standing in the open doorway of that forgotten building, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across dust and shadow. I expected cobwebs, broken tools, maybe an old horse cart. Instead, What I saw made my knees weaken. 3 vehicles stood before me, each covered with a custom-fitted cloth sheet, arranged with almost obsessive precision. It was the gleaming object peeking from beneath the nearest cover that stopped my heart entirely, the unmistakable silver grille of what appeared to be a vintage Aston Martin. Its polished surface caught the narrow beam of my flashlight like a mirror reflecting time itself. "What on earth?" I whispered. I stepped forward, drawn by disbelief. My fingers trembled as I pulled the cover away, revealing an immaculate 1964 Aston Martin DB5 in silver birch identical to the one Sean Connery drove in those old Bond films Richard adored. The car gleamed as though it had just rolled out of the factory, not sat hidden for decades. "Richard," I breathed. "What were you doing all these years?" My husband had never mentioned any interest in automobiles. In 42 years of marriage, there had never been a hint of such a passion. No secret collection, no talk of investment vehicles, nothing. I moved to the next one, lifting the second cover, to reveal a 1956 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, its doors closed like folded wings, the deep navy paintwork immaculate chrome, gleaming like frozen light. The third car under a crimson cloth was a Ferrari 275 GTB4. The color reminded me of the wine Richard would order for our anniversaries, rich dark and full of hidden stories. Each car had a small leather portfolio on a stand beside it, filled with documents, provenance papers, maintenance records, purchase receipts. I wasn't an expert, but even I knew these were no ordinary cars. They were treasures museum pieces. "There must be an explanation," I murmured, my voice echoing faintly in the silent space. That's when I noticed an envelope taped to the wall beside the light switch. It had my name written across it in Richard's unmistakable handwriting. With shaking fingers, I tore it free and flicked the switch. The entire carriage house bloomed into light. Instead of the expected decay, I found a perfectly preserved gallery, polished floors, climate control vents, modern security panels. The old stone exterior had disguised a hidden world within. This wasn't a ruin. It was a sanctuary. I sank onto a leather bench against the far wall, the envelope heavy in my hands. For a long moment, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Then, taking a breath that trembled halfway to a sob, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I came to think of as my final gift to you. I never imagined that the key my husband left me would unlock something far more powerful than a garage door. That night, the rain had turned to a thin mist, wrapping the empty industrial lot in silver light. I stood there, my hand trembling around the key, my breath catching in the cold. My son's voice still echoed in my mind, sharp, cruel, and final. "You're just a useless old woman, Mom. What would you even do with a real inheritance?" Those words had stripped something from me like being pushed out of my own skin. But even through the humiliation, there was a flicker of something else. A pull. A whisper in my chest that said, "Turn the key." The lock resisted at first, creaking in protest, as if it too had secrets to keep. When it finally gave way, the door opened into darkness. The smell hit me first, old motor oil metal and time itself. My flashlight trembled as I raised it, and then I saw them. 3 shapes beneath fitted cloth covers, arranged with almost military precision. Not the junk I'd expected from an abandoned garage, but reverence. I pulled the cover off the nearest shape, and a flash of silver caught the light, sleek, elegant, impossible. A 1964 Aston Martin DB5. My heart skipped. My husband Richard had never once mentioned a passion for cars. Not once in 42 years. My voice broke as I whispered, "Richard, what were you hiding from me?" And then, just as I took another step, the silence fractured. A soft, Mechanical click. My light swung toward the wall. There, mounted above the workbench, was a small black device with a red indicator blinking faintly. A voice recorder. My heart pounded in my throat. I pressed play. Static filled the air, then his voice. My husband's voice. Eleanor. If you're hearing this, then I've already gone. Don't be afraid of what you find here. I built this place for you. Everything inside it is part of your inheritance and your freedom. I froze. My flashlight trembled. His voice sounded so close, so alive, that for a heartbeat, I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there smiling, that quiet smile that always made me feel safe. But he was gone. Still, his voice continued calm, deliberate, full of something that felt both like love and warning. The will reading must have been painful. I needed you to see Jonathan for who he truly is. I couldn't protect you while I was alive, not without taking away his chance to reveal his own heart. That's why I left you this key. Because you deserve to know the truth. About him. About me. About what really happened. My knees weakened. What really happened? The flashlight beam shook as I looked around the garage again. It was immaculate, every tool aligned, every shelf labeled. This wasn't chaos. This was design. I found the envelope taped to the wall, my name written in Richard's familiar, steady handwriting. Eleanor Campbell. Inside was a letter, and as I unfolded it, tears blurred my vision. My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, then you've discovered what I came to think of as my final gift to you. First, forgive the secrecy. It wasn't meant to hurt you, but to protect what I was building for your future. I sank onto the old leather stool beside the workbench, my chest tightening as his words continued. When I learned about my heart condition 6 years ago, the doctors gave me 5 years. I made it 6. Every day of that extra year was a gift because it gave me time to prepare. But I couldn't prepare our son. I saw him changing, growing harder. I feared what he might do if I left everything to both of you equally. So I made a choice, a painful one. I left you the truth disguised as loss, and him the illusion of victory. A tear fell onto the page, smudging the ink. He had seen what I had refused to see. Jonathan's ambition had long ago curdled into greed. The letter continued. This garage and its contents are yours. The 3 cars you see before you, the Aston Martin, the Mercedes 300 SL, and the Ferrari 275, are not just cars. They're assets worth more than $12 million. Their paperwork is in the portfolios beside them, and that's only the beginning. The safe behind our photo from Venice holds deeds, accounts, and trust documents all in your name. Don't be frightened by the scale of it. Use it as I intended to build the life you deserve, free from anyone's control. I could hardly breathe. The photo from Venice, the one of us laughing on the Rialto Bridge, hung right there on the far wall. My hands trembled as I lifted it, revealing a small safe behind it. The combination, our anniversary. When I turned the dial, the soft click of the mechanism sounded almost like a heartbeat. Inside were files, USB drives, and a small velvet box. I opened it and gasped. It was my wedding ring, the original one I'd lost years ago. Alongside it, a note in his handwriting. You thought it slipped away in Venice. I found it the next morning. I've kept it safe for this moment because love, my darling, never truly gets lost. It just waits. I pressed the ring to my lips. For the first time since his funeral, I allowed myself to sob. When I finally lifted my head, something glinted behind the stack of documents. Another small envelope. Inside, a single photograph, a young woman I didn't recognize, smiling, standing beside a vintage car. On the back, in Richard's handwriting, ask Marcus. Marcus, The name was in the letter too, his trusted advisor. I needed answers. But before I could process it, the voice recorder clicked again, startling me. I hadn't pressed anything. Eleanor Richards' voice repeated softer now. If you found the photo, don't be afraid. The woman in it isn't what you think. She's part of the reason you're safe. Safe from what? The words sent a chill through me. The garage, which had moments before felt like sanctuary, suddenly seemed alive with shadows. I looked around, the climate control hum, the precision of the lights, even the new locks on the doors. All of it felt intentional. Too intentional. Could Richard have been protecting me from something or someone? The next morning, I returned to the garage in daylight. The sun revealed more detail, the polished floor, the faint scent of leather and oil, and the immaculate organization that was so unlike my husband. I placed the photo of the woman under a magnifying glass from the workbench. A small badge on her jacket read, Weatherby Motors. Marcus Weatherby, the advisor from Richard's letter. I dialed the number written in his notes. He answered on the second ring. Mrs. Campbell, a calm British voice said, I've been expecting your call. I froze, expecting me. How did you know I would? Richard told me you'd call within 24 hours of discovering the safe. He was never wrong about you. His voice carried an odd mixture of warmth and authority. Would you like me to come to the property? I imagine you have questions. Yes, I said quietly. Many. Marcus arrived 2 hours later, a man in his 60s, silver-haired, wearing a brown tweed jacket. His handshake was steady and his eyes kind but sharp. This was Richard's private sanctuary, he explained, surveying the garage. He built it from the ground up over the past 6 years. Every vehicle, every document, every security feature planned with purpose. He wanted you to have more than money. He wanted you to have independence. As he spoke, I felt the air grow heavier. I handed him the photograph. Who is she? He took one look and sighed. That's Charlotte Weatherby, he said. My late wife. She helped Richard with restoration work. She passed away 3 years ago. That's why he stopped coming here regularly. The tension in my chest eased, but not entirely. Why didn't he tell me? Because he didn't want you to worry, Marcus said gently. He kept this place secret to protect both of you. You from your son's greed, and your son from his own nature. By the time he left, my world had shifted again. The grief hadn't gone. But underneath it, something was blooming clarity. For 42 years, I'd thought of myself as a wife, a mother, someone who depended on others to define her worth. But standing there surrounded by what Richard had built in silence and love, I felt something awaken. Power, freedom. And beneath it all, a question I couldn't ignore. Why had my husband, a man of peace, prepared for something that felt so much like war? That night, as I locked the garage and stepped into the cool air, I looked up at the sky clouds, parting just enough to reveal a slice of moonlight. The key hung warm in my hand, as if it remembered everything my heart was still learning to believe. You're just a useless old woman, Mom, Jonathan had said. But maybe that was the mistake Richard had been protecting me from, all along believing that my worth ended when someone else stopped seeing it. Before we continue, what do you think Richard was hiding? Was it zero pure love, or one a secret that could still change everything? Type your answer below. Because in the next chapter, Eleanor opens a hidden compartment in the garage, and what she finds will change her forever. When the morning light finally broke through the fog outside the garage, Eleanor Campbell realized something had shifted inside her. For the first time since her husband's death, the tears had dried not because she had run out of them, but because she no longer needed them. She brewed herself a small cup of coffee on the kitchenette's electric plate, the same one Richard had installed years ago, and stared at the 3 cars glimmering under the LED lights. Each one seemed to hold a secret, a memory, a message. She thought about the voice recorder, the letter, the photograph of Charlotte Weatherby, and the name Marcus had spoken so gently the day before. He wanted you to have independence. Those words echoed in her mind like a hymn. For 42 years, her world had revolved around others, her husband's ambitions, her son's expectations, the rhythm of a life built for someone else's comfort. Now, for the first time, there was silence, not the hollow kind that haunts grief, but the kind that asks, "What if you began again?" Eleanor moved to the Aston Martin. The car looked alive in the light, its silver curves glistening like a promise. She reached inside the driver's seat, her fingertips brushing over the leather. Something metallic clinked. A small brass key had slipped from the crease between the seat and the console. Tied to it with a faded blue ribbon was a note written in Richard's handwriting. "For when you're ready. Box number 312. A safe deposit box." Her pulse quickened. Richard's surprises, it seemed, weren't done revealing themselves. 2 hours later, Eleanor stood inside the marble lobby of Pacific Union Bank, clutching the key as if it were a relic from another life. The clerk led her into the private vault where the walls seemed to hum with quiet power. Box number 312 slid out from the wall with a soft, metallic sigh. Inside, neatly stacked and secured with ribbon, were photographs, documents, and a small black notebook bound in leather. She opened it carefully. Each page contained her husband's familiar handwriting, dated precise, almost clinical. But what it described made her heart twist. Jonathan's behavior worsening. Dismissed staff again. Questionable financial transfers from family accounts to offshore holdings. Must act soon discreetly. The entries continued, each one more alarming than the last. Notes about Jonathan's company debts, risky investments, and the quiet liquidation of family-owned assets. Then came a page written 3 months before Richard's death. Confirmed Jonathan has borrowed against the penthouse equity without disclosure. If something happens to me, Eleanor must not depend on him financially. He's lost sight of integrity. My decision will look cruel, but it's protection, not punishment. The notebook trembled in her hands. Her own son, Richard, had known he'd seen everything coming. Eleanor sat back in the vault chair, her breath-shallow eyes fixed on the pages that felt like a chronicle of betrayal. For a brief moment, she thought of how many betrayal stories she'd read over the years, stories about families torn apart by greed, by lies, by the simple failure to see love for what it truly was. And now she realized she was living one of them. Except this wasn't fiction. This was her life. That evening, back in the garage, Eleanor replayed Richard's recorded message one more time. "If he has revealed a different nature," her husband's voice said, "then this legacy is your protection against that reality. Your independence, your freedom." Independence, freedom. Words that sounded so large, so distant, and yet now so possible. Eleanor went to the mirror in the small office and stared at her reflection. The woman who looked back was older, yes, lined by time and grief, but there was something new in her eyes, a quiet defiance. She thought of Jonathan's last words at the penthouse. "You're just a useless old woman, Mom." And for the first time, she smiled. Because maybe that's what he wanted to believe, so he wouldn't have to face what she truly was. She spent the next morning cleaning the garage, a ritual, a reclaiming of space. The rhythmic sound of a rag on chrome, the scent of wax and oil, the hum of air conditioning all became her own quiet symphony of survival. When Marcus returned that afternoon, she had the notebook ready on the desk. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the pages silently. When he finished, his expression was grave, but unsurprised. "He feared this, you know," Marcus said softly. "Richard loved your son deeply, but love can't blind a man forever." Eleanor closed the notebook. "He was right," she said. "Jonathan's already reached out through intermediaries, asking for money." Marcus nodded slowly. The first phase of every downfall begins with denial. Then desperation. You'll need to be strong, Mrs. Campbell. I am, she said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Stronger than I've ever been. He smiled faintly. Richard believed you would be. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The notebook lay open beside her bed, its words burning into her thoughts. The house, the cars, the fortune, all of it had been her husband's attempt to protect her. But now she realized it wasn't about protection anymore. It was about transformation. If she was to truly honor his gift, she couldn't hide behind his choices. She had to make her own. At dawn, she took the Aston Martin out for the first time. The engine roared to life, deep and confident. As she guided it onto the coastal highway, wind tangling her hair, she felt a surge of energy that defied age. For miles, she drove without destination, letting the sun rise over the ocean, letting her heart remember what it felt like to move forward, to choose direction, speed, and freedom for herself. It wasn't just a drive, it was resurrection. By the time she returned to Carmel, she knew what to do. The betrayal had carved something open inside her, but it also made room for clarity. This wasn't just one of those betrayal stories that ended in bitterness or revenge. This was going to be her reclamation story, a story about taking back her voice, her worth, and her peace. That afternoon, she visited Patricia Winters, the estate attorney Marcus had recommended. Patricia was a sharp, composed woman in her 50s, with kind eyes that hinted at 1,000 unspoken stories of loss and resilience. I've reviewed your husband's structures, Patricia said, sliding documents across the desk. They're airtight, but the real question, Mrs. Campbell, is what you want to do with this freedom now. Eleanor paused. I want to secure my future, but I also want to understand my sons. Patricia leaned back. That's a complicated wish. Life's complicated, Eleanor said quietly. But I refuse to become another silent mother in the background of a betrayal story. I won't vanish into anyone's shadow again. Patricia's lips curved slightly. Then let's begin. Over the next several weeks, Eleanor worked closely with Patricia and Marcus to restructure Richard's holdings into new trusts, this time under her sole control. She visited the cottage in Carmel again, tending the garden, reconnecting with small joys, the sound of birds, the smell of salt in the air, the simple peace of making her own choices. Slowly, the weight of helplessness began to lift, and as she rebuilt her life piece by piece, something unexpected happened. She began to dream again. Not of the past, not of revenge, but of purpose. Maybe she could start a foundation, she thought, one dedicated to helping older women rebuild after loss, betrayal, or financial ruin. After all, betrayal stories like hers weren't rare. They just weren't often told by the ones who survived them. Late one evening, as she closed the notebook and turned off the lights, Eleanor stood by the window overlooking the quiet streets of Carmel. The reflection in the glass was no longer a woman broken by grief. It was a survivor, and more than that, a creator. Richard's plan had given her safety, but her own courage was giving her rebirth. As she whispered a soft goodnight into the stillness, she could almost hear Richard's voice again. You're stronger than you know, Ellie. She smiled through tears, whispering back, You have no idea. Then, turning toward the moonlit sea, she took a deep breath and let the air fill her chest, calm, certain, alive. If you believe that strength can bloom even from betrayal, give this story a like. Your support helps keep stories like this one alive. Stories of resilience, hope, and love that endures. The sea had a way of speaking to her now. Every morning, Eleanor Campbell would open the windows of the cottage and let the wind carry the scent of salt and rosemary through the rooms. It was different from the sterile stillness of her old townhouse in London. Here, the air felt alive. She'd wake before dawn, light a small candle in the kitchen, and brew coffee in the old French press Richard had insisted on bringing during their last vacation together. The sound of the waves became her metronome, steady, patient, eternal. For the first time in years, her days belonged to her. No one asked for anything. No one corrected her tone, her memory, her decisions. The silence of the house was no longer loneliness. It was peace. Outside, the garden had begun to bloom again. When she first arrived in Carmel, the roses had wilted, the hydrangeas were dry, and ivy crawled along the cottage walls like green scars. But Eleanor had rolled up her sleeves, put on her wide-brimmed hat, and spent her mornings restoring what time and neglect had claimed. She knelt in the dirt, her hands covered in soil, her back aching, but her heart felt young again. It wasn't just about gardening. It was about returning life to something that had been forgotten. Maybe that's what Richard had meant when he called this place her sanctuary. One afternoon, while pruning near the terrace, Eleanor found something unusual. Behind a weathered clay pot was a wind chime handmade from seashells, glass beads, and small pieces of driftwood. It swayed softly in the wind, its melody both haunting and tender. She recognized it immediately. Richard had made it during their 25th anniversary trip to Big Sur. He'd spent an entire afternoon collecting shells while she read under an umbrella. When she touched the chime, one of the shells came loose. It hit the ground with a sharp clink, and out fell a folded note sealed in plastic. Her pulse quickened. The handwriting was unmistakably his. "For Eleanor when you find peace." Her breath caught. She sat on the terrace bench, the afternoon sun glinting off the water, and unfolded the note carefully. "My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, it means you found your way back to the sea. I knew you would. There's something about this place, about the sound of the waves, that reminds me of who we used to be before the noise of the world crept in. I built this cottage for you, not just as a refuge, but as a promise. A place where you could remember how to love life again, even without me. But if you've come here, it also means something else, that the truth about Jonathan has reached you. I hoped it wouldn't hurt you the way I feared it might. Please, my love, don't let anger be the only thing left between you. I know him. He's lost, not evil. He's searching for love in all the wrong places, just like I once did before you." Eleanor stopped reading. Her throat tightened. She stared out at the horizon, the line where the sky met the Pacific, and felt her heart ache in that tender, unfixable way that grief teaches you to live with. That night she dreamed of him. In the dream, Richard stood on the shore barefoot, wearing the same linen shirt he used to wear on summer evenings. He was younger, smiling, waving her closer. But every time she tried to step toward him, the tide rose and he drifted farther away. When she woke, tears had dampened the pillow. But this time, they didn't sting. They felt cleansing, like rain after drought. The next morning, she called Marcus Weatherby. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm but thoughtful, "did Richard ever tell you about a wind chime?" He paused. "Yes, actually. He mentioned once that he hid something in it, said you'd find it only when you were ready." "What did it say?" Eleanor hesitated. "That I shouldn't let anger be the last thing between Jonathan and me." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like Richard. He always believed love was stronger than truth. But I think in your case, you'll need both." His words lingered in her mind long after the call ended. In the days that followed, Eleanor began to find small signs of her husband everywhere. The old typewriter in the study still had a half-finished letter in it addressed to her. A music box on the nightstand played the first notes of Moon River, their wedding song. Even the pantry, perfectly organized, still carried his quiet discipline. Each discovery felt like a conversation across time, not haunting, but comforting. She realized then that grief wasn't a single moment of pain. It was 1,000 quiet recognitions that love had once lived here. One Sunday, she invited Patricia Winters and Marcus for lunch. They sat on the terrace overlooking the water, enjoying fresh bread olives and white wine. Patricia smiled. "You've made this place feel alive again. I almost forgot what laughter sounded like the last time I saw you." Eleanor chuckled softly. "It's strange, isn't it? You lose everything, and suddenly the small things, sunlight, coffee, music, they feel sacred. Marcus lifted his glass. To sacred things, then, and to Richard for seeing your strength long before anyone else did. They toasted, and for the first time Eleanor didn't feel like a widow surrounded by reminders of the past. She felt like a woman still living her story. That evening, as the sky turned gold, she stood at the edge of the garden, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. A pair of dolphins leaped in the distance, brief, perfect arcs of motion against the fading light. She thought of Richard's letter again. He's lost, not evil. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was time to find out. She went inside, opened her notebook, and wrote Jonathan's name at the top of a fresh page. Beneath it, just 2 words, start again. Later that night, when the wind picked up and the chime outside began to sing again, she stood by the window and whispered, I'm not angry anymore, Richard. I'm just learning how to live. The shells clinked together softly as if answering her. For the first time since his funeral, she felt warmth instead of absence, gratitude instead of guilt. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was something purer, quieter. Peace. A few days later, a letter arrived in the mail. No return address. Just her name written in hurried strokes. When she opened it, her hands trembled. Mother, I've made terrible mistakes. I know that now. Please don't give up on me. I need help, but I don't know how to ask. Jonathan. The paper was smudged, as if written in haste or regret. Eleanor folded it slowly, pressing it to her chest. Outside, the chime swayed again, catching the light of the setting sun. She didn't know what the next step would look like, but she knew she'd take it. Not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of love, the quiet, enduring kind that survives the storm. That night, she wrote in her journal, Peace isn't silence. It's the moment you forgive someone who isn't even sorry yet. She smiled to herself, closing the notebook. As she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, she realized she no longer felt haunted by the past. She felt guided by it. Richard's voice no longer echoed from the recorder or the letters. It lived somewhere softer now inside her heartbeat, in the rhythm of the waves, in the laughter that would someday return to this house. The woman who had walked into that garage months ago was gone. In her place was someone new, someone whole. If you felt the calm of Eleanor's sea, give this story a like. Every bit of support helps these stories of love loss and rebirth reach one more heart that needs them. The morning after Jonathan arrived, Eleanor woke to the faint sound of footsteps in the kitchen. For a second, she thought it was Richard, the familiar rhythm of a man who always rose early, who whistled tunelessly while making coffee. But when she entered the kitchen, it was her son, hair unkempt, still wearing yesterday's shirt, standing uncertainly beside the coffee maker. He looked up sheepish. Didn't want to wake you. Eleanor smiled softly. You didn't. The ocean usually does that first. He nodded, managing a faint smile. It was awkward, painfully human, like 2 strangers trying to remember a language they once shared. They ate breakfast mostly in silence. The sound of waves filled the spaces words couldn't. At one point, Jonathan said quietly, I listened to Dad's message again. Eleanor set her cup down. And I think I finally heard it this time. She didn't ask what that meant. She didn't need to. The softness in his voice said more than any confession could. For the first time in years, they talked about simple things. The cottage repairs, the garden, even the sea air that made everything smell faintly like salt and memories. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of it. That afternoon, while Jonathan took a walk along the cliffs, Eleanor returned to the study. She hadn't entered since before he came. Now sunlight fell across the desk in long, golden lines. The air smelled of cedar and paper. She began sorting through Richard's old files, not for business, but for closure. In the bottom drawer beneath a stack of financial statements, she found a plain envelope without a label. The handwriting on it was unmistakably Richard's, though different this time, smaller, hesitant, almost apologetic. It was addressed not to her, but to someone named Evelyn Grant. Her pulse quickened. She sat down, heart pounding, and unfolded the letter. Evelyn, I don't expect forgiveness, but I need to tell the truth before I run out of time. The investment failure wasn't yours. It was mine. I moved funds too soon, trying to protect my family's assets, and in doing so, I cost you everything. I told the board it was your decision because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my reputation, my son's respect, my wife's trust. I've carried that guilt every day since. If Eleanor ever finds this, I hope she knows I never betrayed her, only myself. Eleanor's breath caught. She read the letter twice, then 3 times, unable to process what it meant. All those years, she'd believed Richard was flawless, the steady compass of their lives. But here, in his own handwriting, was proof that even he had been broken, that his perfection had come at the cost of truth. And Evelyn Grant, that name. It echoed faintly in memory. She'd met her once, briefly at a charity gala 20 years ago. A quiet woman with kind eyes and a reputation ruined almost overnight after a failed investment. When Jonathan returned, she was still sitting at the desk, the letter trembling in her hand. He frowned. "Mom, what is it?" Eleanor hesitated. Then she handed him the page. Read it. He did. Slowly. His face shifted from confusion to shock. Then something softer, sorrow maybe. "Dad blamed someone else," he whispered. "Yes." Jonathan sank into the chair opposite her. "All this time, I thought he was perfect, that I could never measure up. But he was just human." Eleanor finished for him. He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what broke me. Trying to live up to someone who didn't exist." Eleanor reached across the desk and took his hand. "He wasn't perfect, but he loved us. Even his mistakes were made in fear of losing us." Jonathan's eyes glistened. "Why didn't he tell you?" She sighed. "Because he was protecting me from the truth, just like he protected you from your own." They sat there quietly for a long time, the kind of silence that no longer hurt, only healed. That evening, the sky turned the same copper red Richard used to call forgiveness weather. Eleanor and Jonathan sat on the porch, sipping tea, listening to the wind chimes sing above them. "I used to think he favored you," Jonathan said. "That everything he did was to make sure you were safe, and I was tested." Eleanor smiled sadly. "He did favor me, maybe, but not in the way you think. He trusted me to remember him with love, no matter what truths I found later. That's harder than it sounds." Jonathan looked at her. "And now that you know this, does it change how you see him?" She thought for a moment. "No, it just makes him real, and that makes his love worth more, not less." Later that night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She walked back into the study, opened the window, and let the sea breeze scatter the papers across the desk. Among them, one photograph slipped to the floor, Richard younger, standing beside a woman she recognized now as Evelyn Grant. They were both smiling, unaware of how the world would later twist their story. Eleanor picked up the photo and whispered, "You both paid for one mistake." Then she folded it carefully and placed it inside the letter, not to erase it, but to keep the truth whole. Over the next few days, something quiet but undeniable changed between her and Jonathan. He began helping in the garden, fixing the fence, cooking simple dinners. There was laughter sometimes, awkward, cautious, but real. One morning, she found him sitting by the piano in the living room, the same one Richard had restored decades ago. Jonathan was playing softly, haltingly, like someone relearning an old memory. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching. "Dad used to play this on Sundays," he said, without turning. "I never told him I remembered." She smiled. He knew. By the end of the week, Jonathan said he wanted to visit his father's grave. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I think he'd like that." They drove in silence through the coastal road, the car cutting through morning fog. When they reached the small cemetery overlooking the cliffs, Jonathan stood still for a long time before kneeling beside the headstone. He brushed the leaves away and whispered something Eleanor couldn't hear. Then quietly he said, I forgive you, Dad. Her throat tightened. She stepped forward and placed her hand on his shoulder. Forgiveness doesn't erase the pain, she said softly. It just means the pain has somewhere to go. That night, after they returned home, Eleanor placed Richard's letter to Evelyn inside a wooden box, along with her wedding ring, his notebook, and the flash drive. These weren't trophies or burdens anymore. They were fragments of truth. Pieces of a man, a marriage, a family, learning to tell the truth about love. When she closed the lid, she felt something inside her shift, a quiet release. The house didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt honest. She whispered toward the air. You were flawed, Richard, but so am I. And somehow, that makes everything make sense. Later, as she stood on the porch with Jonathan watching the moon rise over the Pacific, he said quietly, maybe we can start a foundation together for people who've made mistakes, lost everything, and still want to start again. Eleanor looked at him with tears shining in her eyes. That's exactly what your father would have wanted, he smiled. Maybe it's what we both need. The chime rang once in the breeze, not mournful now, but bright like laughter carried on the wind. In that moment, Eleanor understood something she'd never put into words. Love doesn't survive because it's perfect. It survives because it's honest enough to begin again. If this part touched you, give the story a like. Your support helps keep stories of truth loss and second chances alive for others who might need them. Eleanor Campbell had always believed strength was something men demonstrated with volume and women carried in silence. Now standing at her kitchen counter with a legal notice in her hands, she realized strength could also speak quietly, clearly, and with precision. The envelope bore the seal of Garrison and Vale Investments, a name she hadn't heard since Richard's funeral. Inside lay a formal letter the firm intended to contest ownership of several assets Richard had transferred to her name. They claimed he'd acted under emotional influence, suggesting she'd persuaded him during his final illness. It was absurd and cruelly ironic. The same world that once ignored her existence as a wife was now accusing her of manipulation as a widow. She placed the letter flat on the counter, took a steady breath, and whispered, Not this time. When Jonathan entered a few minutes later, he noticed the paper instantly. What's that? A reminder, she said, that freedom always comes with a price. He read the letter, his face paling. They can't do this, Mom. Dad's estate was settled. You have every document, every signature. They can and they are, she replied evenly. But we'll answer. He clenched his jaw. Let me handle it. Eleanor looked at him, the man her son was slowly becoming. No, Jonathan. You'll help, but you won't lead this battle. Not yet. Why not? Because anger still drives you, she said gently. And anger can't win a war of patience. Her tone wasn't sharp, just immovable. Jonathan sat back, breathing out the argument before it began. Then what do? We set rules, she said, for them and for us. By afternoon, Patricia Winters arrived, briefcase in hand and eyes blazing with professional calm. They're bluffing, Patricia said, scanning the papers. But we'll respond decisively. If they sense hesitation, they'll circle like sharks. Eleanor smiled faintly. Then let's give them still water, not blood. Patricia laughed softly. That's why Richard trusted you. You don't fight loud. You fight smart. Jonathan shifted uneasily. You two sound like generals? Eleanor turned to him. That's exactly what we are, protecting a legacy, not attacking one. Over the next days, the cottage transformed into a command center. Legal documents covered the dining table. The phone rang with updates from accountants and analysts. Yet through it all, Eleanor stayed calm. Her morning rituals, coffee, candle, sea air, remained untouched. Jonathan watched in awe. The mother who once cried in silence was now writing strategy memos, quoting financial statutes, and correcting lawyers with quiet precision. One evening, as the sun sank into the horizon, he said, I never realized how much you listened all those years. Eleanor looked up from her notes. Listening was the only weapon I was allowed. 3 days later, Patricia called with news that changed everything. Eleanor, she said the firm's claim isn't just about assets. Someone inside leaked copies of Richard's correspondence, including a letter to Evelyn Grant. Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. They have that? Yes. And they're hinting at using it to suggest Richard's judgment was compromised, a personal entanglement, as they put it. Jonathan overheard his expression hardening. They're dragging his name through the mud to scare you. They're testing me, Eleanor corrected. And I intend to let them find out how strong patience can be. That night, she stood alone on the porch, the wind carrying salt and whispers from the waves. Her husband's mistakes, her son's redemption, her own awakening, all of it had led to this moment. She could feel Richard near, not as a ghost, but as memory transformed into resolve. She whispered, "You built the walls. I'll protect what's inside." The next morning, Eleanor visited the city for the first time in months. Patricia had arranged a mediation meeting with the firm's senior partners at their San Francisco office, sleek glass cold marble, the kind of place where power measured itself in silence. As she stepped into the boardroom, every eye turned toward her, the widow they'd underestimated. The lead partner, Mr. Vale, stood. "Mrs. Campbell, we appreciate your cooperation. We simply need clarity about your late husband's mental state." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "You'll find clarity in the documents, and perhaps a lesson in restraint." He smiled thinly. "Our concern is for accuracy." "No," she said softly. "Your concern is for control, and that's no longer for sale." The room went silent. After 2 hours of quiet battle, precise answers measured pauses, the tone shifted. Vale's confidence cracked under the weight of her composure. When he hinted again about the Evelyn Grant letter, she slid a folder across the table. Inside was a notarized statement from Evelyn herself, one Eleanor had obtained through Patricia the night before. It read, "Mr. Richard Campbell acted with complete independence and integrity. I hold no claim, financial or otherwise, against his estate." Eleanor's eyes never left Vale's. "Your leverage just turned to dust," she said. Patricia smiled behind her hand. The meeting ended quickly after that. On the drive home, Jonathan looked out the window, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold. "Mom," he said quietly, "I didn't know you had that in you." She chuckled. "Neither did I. But sometimes we don't find our voice until someone tries to take it." He nodded slowly. "Dad would have been proud." Eleanor glanced at him. "I don't do this for pride, Jonathan. I do it to protect peace, and peace needs rules." That night, back at the cottage, they celebrated with a simple dinner soup bread and laughter that felt earned. Afterward, Eleanor walked down to the beach alone. The waves glowed under the moonlight, soft and steady, like the heartbeat of something older than grief. She thought of Richard, of Evelyn, of all the lies and truths that had woven their family together. None of it felt heavy anymore. Just real. When she returned, Jonathan was waiting on the porch. He held 2 mugs of tea. "You know," he said, "for years I thought control meant power. But watching you today, control looks more like kindness with a backbone." Eleanor smiled. "That's a good definition. One you'll need if you're serious about the foundation." He nodded. "I am, but I want to build it your way, carefully, with structure." "Then you'll do well," she said, "because compassion without discipline is chaos." He laughed. "You sound like Dad." "Good," she replied softly. "He taught me well, even in silence." Before bed, Eleanor opened her journal and wrote, "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering differently without surrendering wisdom." She closed the book, placed it beside the photo from Venice, and blew out the candle. The wind outside rattled the chime once, not warning this time, but approval. In the following weeks, word arrived that the firm had withdrawn its claim entirely. Patricia sent flowers and a note, "Victory tastes better when it's quiet." Eleanor smiled when she read it. She didn't feel victorious. She felt steady, as if life had finally reached an even breath. On a calm Sunday morning, Jonathan joined her in the garden planting rosemary along the fence. He said, I used to think peace was boring. Eleanor laughed. Peace isn't boring, dear. It's the luxury of people who survive the noise. He smiled. Then I guess we've earned it. They worked side by side until the light shifted golden again, the same hour Richard used to call the forgiving hour. As the day faded, Eleanor realized that strength no longer meant resistance. It meant clarity. She'd set boundaries not out of coldness, but love that refused to enable love, that protected rather than indulged. And for the first time, she knew she wasn't living in the shadow of her husband's plans anymore. She was living in her own. That night, she poured 2 glasses of wine, handed one to Jonathan, and raised hers. To the rules of grace, she said. He frowned slightly. The rules of what? Grace, she repeated. The quiet discipline of loving without losing yourself. He nodded slowly, the words sinking in like tidewater into sand. I'll try to remember that. You will, she said, because you'll have to. Outside, the chimes swayed in the breeze, and the sound drifted through the open window, the soft, steady music of a house finally at peace. Eleanor closed her eyes, listening, smiling faintly. She had faced accusation, defended truth, guided her son, and found her own power in the calm between storms. And somewhere she imagined Richard's voice, proud, gentle teasing. Told you, Ellie. You always were the strong one. She whispered back into the night. I just needed time to believe it. It had been nearly 6 months since the storm of legal battles and revelations had finally quieted. The cottage by the sea now smelled of rosemary and lemon polish, a home restored not just in structure, but in spirit. Eleanor Campbell had learned to enjoy stillness again, the rhythmic crash of waves, the cry of gulls, the simple ritual of setting 2 cups of coffee, though sometimes only one would be drunk. Jonathan had stayed. At first, she'd thought it would be temporary a pause before he returned to the city. But days became weeks, and weeks became a life redefined. He helped around the house, tended the garden, joined her on long walks along the cliffs. They spoke easily now about books, music, even politics, subjects once avoided at every holiday dinner. The old tension had dissolved into something fragile, but real trust rebuilt from ruin. One breezy afternoon, Eleanor was reading on the porch when she saw a gray sedan pull into the drive. A tall man stepped out neatly dressed, carrying a leather briefcase worn soft by years of use. He removed his hat politely. Mrs. Campbell. Yes, she said, standing. Can I help you? My name is Thomas Avery. I was a business partner of your husband's. And an old friend. Eleanor froze. The name rang faintly familiar, a voice from decades ago, one Richard had mentioned in passing when recalling his early ventures. I'm sorry to arrive unannounced, Avery continued, but Richard asked me to deliver something personally when the time was right. Her breath caught. When the time was right. He nodded. His exact words. I wasn't sure what that meant until I read about the Campbell Foundation's launch last week. Eleanor glanced toward the open door where Jonathan was typing on his laptop. The foundation, their joint project to support older adults rebuilding after financial or personal loss, had just gained local recognition. The timing felt uncanny. Avery placed the briefcase on the porch railing and opened it carefully. Inside lay a single sealed envelope, yellowed at the edges, but untouched. Richard's handwriting sprawled across it. For Eleanor and Jonathan when the house is at peace. Eleanor's hands trembled as she took it. Richard gave this to you. Avery smiled gently. He trusted me with it 10 years ago. Said I'd know when to deliver it. I hope I guessed right. She nodded slowly, emotion pressing behind her ribs. Yes, Mr. Avery. I think you did. That evening, as the sun dropped into the Pacific, Eleanor and Jonathan sat at the dining table with the unopened letter between them. Neither spoke for a while. The chime outside swayed softly, marking time like a heartbeat. Finally, Jonathan said, Do you want to read it first? No, Eleanor whispered. He wrote it to both of us. We'll read it together. She broke the seal, unfolding the paper carefully, the same crisp stationery Richard always used. His handwriting was firm but tender, as if he'd written every word with thought and restraint. My dearest Eleanor, my beloved son, if this letter has found its way to you, it means what I prayed for has come to pass. You've found peace with each other. That alone is worth more than all I ever built or lost. When I wrote this, the future was uncertain. I carried secrets, mistakes I couldn't undo, choices I couldn't explain without causing pain. But I believed in something stronger than explanation, love renewed through truth. I was never afraid of dying. I was afraid of leaving you both unfinished, each carrying a piece of my silence. If you're reading this together, then the silence has ended. Now let it turn into purpose. The foundation you build, make it not about my name, but about your courage to begin again. And Jonathan, forgive yourself as I forgave you long before I left. Love, Richard. Eleanor's vision blurred as she reached the end. Her fingers traced the ink where his pen had pressed too hard, as though even in writing Richard had fought for the right words. Across the table, Jonathan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He knew, he whispered. He knew we'd find our way back. Yes, Eleanor said softly. He always believed love could outlast pride. Later that night, Jonathan sat outside while Eleanor tidied the table. When she joined him, the stars had appeared, the sky full and deep. Mom, he said quietly, I keep thinking about the line, make it not about my name. Maybe we should rename the foundation. She smiled. What would you call it? He thought for a moment. The Grant Campbell Initiative? For Rebuilding Lives, after Evelyn Grant. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. Evelyn, he nodded. Because she was part of Dad's truth, too. I read her statement again last week. She forgave him. We wouldn't be here without that kind of grace. Eleanor considered this, then nodded slowly. You're right. Forgiveness shouldn't hide in history. For the first time, the past didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a bridge. The following week, they invited Thomas Avery to speak at the Foundation's first donor event. The hall was modest local faces, simple decorations, sunlight pouring through tall windows. When Eleanor stepped up to the microphone, her voice was calm but resonant. 6 years ago, she began, I thought my life ended when my husband passed. What I didn't realize was that it was only the silence beginning. We spend so much of life avoiding hard truths, yet it's those truths that save us. She glanced toward Jonathan, who stood beside her, his expression open and proud. This foundation, she continued, isn't just about second chances. It's about learning that forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it gives it a new direction. Applause filled the room, gentle but sincere. Avery approached afterward, shaking her hand warmly. Richard would have been proud, he said. Eleanor smiled. I think he already knows. That night, after everyone had left, she and Jonathan returned to the empty hall to gather the remaining decorations. The room still smelled of flowers and applause. Jonathan carried the framed mission statement they'd unveiled. The Grant Campbell Initiative, helping rebuild lives after loss, because forgiveness is the first step toward freedom. He looked at it thoughtfully. You know, for the first time, I don't feel like I'm living in Dad's shadow. Eleanor touched his arm. You're not. You're standing beside him, and that's where you belong. He smiled, a boyish grin she hadn't seen in decades. Thank you, Mom, for everything. She squeezed his hand. No, Jonathan, thank you for coming home. The drive back to the coast was quiet, the car filled with the sound of wind and ocean scent drifting through the open windows. When they reached the cottage, the moon hung low over the sea, luminous, patient. Eleanor stepped out, closing her eyes, letting the wind touch her face. Jonathan stood beside her. You ever wonder what he'd say if he could see us now? She laughed softly. He'd probably complain that I talked too much during board meetings. Jonathan chuckled. Yeah, then he'd tell me to listen to you anyway. They both laughed, the kind of laughter that mends something unseen. Inside on the mantel, Richard's photograph caught a sliver of moonlight. The same smile calm, knowing seemed to linger just long enough to make the air feel warmer. Eleanor poured 2 glasses of wine and raised hers. To Dad, Jonathan said. She shook her head gently. To us. To what he helped us become. They clinked glasses. The chime outside rang once as if approving. Later, when Jonathan had gone to bed, Eleanor lingered by the window. The ocean shimmered silver in the moonlight, and she whispered the last words of Richard's letter aloud. Now let it turn into purpose. She smiled, not the smile of a woman looking back, but one looking forward. By dawn, the sea mist rolled in again, soft and pale, wrapping the cottage like a blessing. Eleanor watched the horizon and felt a quiet certainty settle inside her. The story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about legacy love that had learned to breathe in truth. If you believe peace can grow from forgiveness, give this story a like. Every small gesture helps keep stories of reconciliation, love, and courage alive for others who might need them. The morning light over the Carmel coast arrived like a benediction, soft gold and forgiving. Eleanor Campbell stood at the window of her cottage, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, gone lukewarm, watching the horizon unfold in slow motion. It had been a year since the foundation's first meeting. A year since Thomas Avery delivered Richard's final letter, that strange message written for when the house is at peace. And somehow it was. The years of silence, anger, and grief had melted into something still and strong, not happiness exactly, but serenity. Jonathan had left for San Francisco the previous night, where he'd been invited to present the Grant Campbell Initiative at a national conference on social reintegration. Eleanor had watched him drive away with a quiet pride that surprised her. He'd grown into the man Richard always hoped he could become, not perfect, but awake. Now the cottage was hers again, at least for a little while. The old wind chime above the porch sang faintly as the morning breeze passed through the same gentle tune that had marked every important moment since Richard's passing. Later that morning, she walked down to the garage, the place where everything began. The place where heartbreak had turned into revelation. The air smelled faintly of oil and salt, the steel doors polished and gleaming, now no longer hidden behind rust and dust. 2 cars remained, the silver Aston Martin she had kept, and the red Ferrari, which she'd decided to donate to the foundation's next charity auction. She walked slowly between them, fingertips grazing the cool metal, remembering the night she had discovered them, the disbelief, the tears, the letter that had changed her life. "You're not a useless old woman, Susan. You're my legacy." That line burned forever into her mind, had once broken her open. Now, it simply made her smile. Inside the adjoining office, the safe still stood behind the framed photo from Venice. Eleanor opened it one last time. Inside were papers, a few of Richard's notes, and a smaller box wrapped in blue ribbon she hadn't noticed before. It wasn't like Richard to leave something hidden, not anymore. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it. Inside was a set of keys and a folded note. "For when you're ready to travel again, love doesn't end at the shoreline." Attached was a small metal tag, Villa Santorini. She laughed softly, a mix of disbelief and wonder. Richard had bought a villa in Greece. "Of course you did," she murmured, half exasperated, half amused. "You always needed one more surprise." 2 weeks later, she stood at the edge of the Aegean Sea, sunlight glittering off the whitewashed walls and blue domes of Santorini. She'd flown out quietly without telling Jonathan until she'd landed. The villa sat halfway up the hill, small, charming, smelling of thyme and sea air. Inside, she found everything: ready clean sheets, fresh towels, even a small envelope on the kitchen counter with a local phone number and a simple line. "For anything you need, call Yanis." She smiled. Richard had thought of everything. Again, the days in Greece passed gently unhurried. Mornings of walking the narrow streets, afternoons on the terrace overlooking the sea, evenings where the sky turned to gold and violet. But beneath the peace, there was something else, a quiet sense of unfinished business. Because every place she went, every church bell or child's laughter, reminded her of how easily she had once let bitterness harden her heart. She knew she'd forgiven Jonathan. She knew she'd forgiven Richard. But what about herself? That question lingered like the echo of waves against the cliffs. On her fourth evening, there was a knock at the door. A man in his late 60s stood there sun-browned and smiling, carrying a basket of bread and olives. "Yanis," he said with a nod. "I keep promises for Mr. Campbell." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "You knew my husband." Yanis smiled. "Everyone knew Mr. Campbell. Quiet man. Came here often. Always asked questions, took notes, never said why." He placed the basket on the counter. "He said you'd come one day, and when you did, to take you to the Cliff House." The Cliff House. He nodded toward the sea. Small church behind it, path down to rocks. "He said you'd understand when you saw it." At sunset, she followed Yanis down the path. The air smelled of sage and sea spray. Behind a tiny white church half hidden by vines stood a small stone cottage built into the cliff. Inside, there was nothing but a writing desk, a chair, and a window that framed the endless sea. On the desk sat another envelope. Her heart stopped. She opened it slowly. "Eleanor, if you've come this far, it means you've learned to live again. This is where I used to write after my treatments, when the pain was quiet and the world felt kind again. I wanted you to have this place not for grief, but for stories. Every line I wrote here was about you. If you ever wonder how I spent my last days, I was watching the sea and thinking about the sound of your laugh. You were never alone even when you thought you were." Eleanor pressed the page to her chest and sat in the chair staring out at the horizon until the sun sank behind it. For the first time in years, she let the tears fall freely. Not in sorrow, but in gratitude. She stayed in Santorini for 3 months. Every morning she wrote. Not about wealth or betrayal or even loss, but about forgiveness. About the strange beauty of getting old and realizing that time doesn't take love away. It refines it. Her essays began as private reflections, but at Yanis's urging, she sent them to a local paper. Within weeks, readers wrote back people who had lost husbands, parents, children. They said her words gave them comfort, hope, perspective. Eleanor realized then what Richard had meant by stories. When she returned to California, summer had turned to autumn. The Grant Campbell Initiative had expanded into 2 states. Jonathan had been nominated for a humanitarian award. When he saw her at the airport, he smiled a deep, genuine smile that made her heart swell. "Greece suits you," he said, hugging her tightly. She laughed. "I think your father knew it would." "I read your essays," he added. "They're beautiful, Mom. You have no idea how many people you've helped." "Maybe I do," she said softly, "because they helped me too." A month later, the foundation hosted a gala dinner in San Francisco. Eleanor stood on the stage, silver hair swept back, wearing a deep blue dress that shimmered like twilight. She looked out over the audience, donors, families, volunteers, and began to speak. "When my husband passed, she said I thought my story had ended. What I didn't know was that endings are just disguised beginnings. When we lose someone, we don't stop loving them, we just start loving them differently." The room was silent, except for the soft clink of glasses and the hush of attention. "My husband left me a garage," she continued, smiling faintly. "And in that garage were cars, yes, but also secrets, memories, lessons. He left me something even more valuable, a chance to learn who I was when no one was watching." Her voice trembled slightly. "If there's one thing I've learned, it's that forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about letting truth breathe." A pause. Then applause, quiet at first, then rising like the tide. Jonathan joined her on stage, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "She taught me everything I forgot about kindness," he said. "And she reminded me that love, the kind that lasts, isn't measured in what we inherit, but what we restore." The next morning, they drove together to the coast. The old Aston Martin gleamed in the sunlight, the same car she had once uncovered in the dark, with shaking hands. They parked by the cliffs and walked down to the sand. The ocean roared softly below. Eleanor carried a small urn, not heavy, but full of meaning. "I kept him long enough," she said quietly. "Now he can rest where he belongs." Jonathan nodded, unable to speak. She opened the urn and let the ashes drift into the wind. The sea carried them outward fragments of light against the waves. For a long time, they stood side by side, the wind whipping Eleanor's hair, tears streaming down both their faces. Then Jonathan said, almost a whisper, "Do you think he can see us?" Eleanor smiled through the tears. "I think he's been with us all along." That evening, back at the cottage, she found herself at the old desk, the same one she'd read Richard's letter on years before. The chime outside rang once, then twice, as if counting time. She picked up her pen and began to write the final line of her memoir. "I used to believe love ended with death. Now I know it ends only when we stop letting it teach us how to live." She signed her name, leaned back, and exhaled the kind of breath that felt like release. A year later, The House at Peace was published. It became unexpectedly popular among older readers across the U.S. and Spain, people who saw themselves in her journey from grief to grace. She received hundreds of letters, some written in shaky cursive, others typed neatly, all saying the same thing. "You told my story." Eleanor read each one by the window, smiling, whispering thanks to the sea beyond the glass. Jonathan married that spring a woman named Emily, gentle and thoughtful, who worked at the foundation. The ceremony was held by the ocean. Eleanor walked her son down the aisle, the roles reversed from tradition, but perfect in their symbolism. When Jonathan whispered, "Thank you for never giving up on me," she replied, "You were always worth the wait." After the ceremony, they released white petals into the tide. The sea carried them gently away, like memories that no longer hurt. Years later, when Eleanor's hair had turned silver white and her hands trembled slightly with age, she sat on that same porch, the wind chimes still singing above her. A young journalist came to interview her for a feature on the Grant Campbell Initiative, now a nationwide network. "What's your secret, Mrs. Campbell?" the journalist asked. "To living such a full life after so much loss." Eleanor smiled, eyes glinting with that timeless calm. "My secret, I stopped trying to fix the past. I started listening to it instead." She looked out toward the horizon where the sunlight shimmered on the waves. "Forgiveness," she said softly, "isn't something you give once. It's something you practice every morning, like breathing." That night, she dreamt of Richard. Not young, not sick, just himself. He stood by the garage, smiling, the chime ringing faintly in the background. "You did it," he said. She reached for him, but the dream began to fade. Before it did, she whispered, "So did you." When morning came, the sea was calm and bright. The chime rang once clear and pure. Jonathan found her sitting in her chair, a gentle smile on her lips, her hand resting on the open book beside her. On the page, her last written words read, "If love has a sound, it's the sea remembering. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, property, or power. It's the courage to forgive, to rebuild, and to keep loving, even after the world says you shouldn't. Love, when told honestly, always finds its way home." If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments, what does forgiveness mean to you? Give this story a like to help more people discover it. Subscribe and follow for more family redemption stories that remind us it's never too late to start over. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Your heart, your attention keeps these stories alive. And remember, the sea always remembers.